Good morning.
Morning.
It is time for us to get going with the class this morning, and so if you'd like to open up your Bibles, you should. It's Esther chapter 7 that we're going to be looking at this morning. We're getting to the end of the story. We're about to hit the climax of the plot. I've talked about this several times, and I'll repeat it again. The book of Esther, more so than any other book in the Bible, I think, is written as a work of literature in the sense of having a very skilled writer who is not simply recounting the facts, but is presenting the story in a way that maximizes the drama and makes it as interesting and as enveloping as possible.
Do you know who wrote it?
Don't know.
You don't?
That's why I have to say the writer of Esther.
The writer, okay.
You know, it doesn't say, and my name's Joe at the end of it or anything like that. It doesn't start off, sorry, Ken.
Yeah, like Paul.
Doesn't start out, Paul, an apostle to the Gentiles or anything like that. It's kind of like the book of Hebrews that just launches into the story. But in a lot of cases, in the Old Testament especially, there are, until you get to the prophets, there are very few books that are in the books themselves identified with a specific author. Moses is attributed the authorship of Genesis through Deuteronomy, I always get the last one. The first five by tradition and by some pretty good solid tradition, but it's attributed to him. But at no point does it actually say that he wrote them. And that's kind of the same way. And of course, with the books like the books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, we know that those were most likely written by a chronicler or by a series of chroniclers who worked for the kings or the royal households or something like that. For the most part, with the books of history, we don't have a specific author's name for them. So we don't know who wrote this, but I do find it interesting that whoever did write it clearly has a much more literary bent than most of the other authors do in terms of like I said, of creating the story. I don't mean inventing the story, but I mean telling the story in a compelling way. And we know the difference between those two things, right? You can have the two people tell the same story, and one of them can tell the story and it kind of falls flat, and the other one can tell the story and it can either leave you laughing or leave you in suspense, or it can really grip your attention just based on how it's presented. And that's the case with the book of Esther. It's not that the story itself needs to be embellished, it's rather how it's told and the methodology that's used that helps to build the suspense and to, as we saw last week, to set up this very humorous and ironic situation that the reader, because they know all of the facts, knows how ridiculous it is or how crazy the whole situation is. But other than maybe Esther, no one inside of the story itself actually knows those things. And again, that's a classic literary technique. If you look at some of Shakespeare's best and most, particularly some of his most amusing plays, they use that exact principle. It's used in Hamlet. It's used in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's used in a number of different ones. Taming of the Shrew, where typically either no one knows or maybe only one or two characters know most of what's going on, and because of that, a lot of what's happening is kind of ridiculous, and there's a lot of humor and a lot of suspense that comes out of that. And so that's what's been happening here. And of course, what we saw last week was that Haman, who has set himself up as the enemy of the Jews, has gotten permission from the king to annihilate the Jews a little less than a year from then. He's been invited to this banquet by Esther, who is using this series of banquets to basically create a situation where she can approach the king about the threat that Haman and his agenda poses. And then in the course of all this, we have a situation where the king overnight can't sleep, wakes up, gets the chronicles of the king read to him, hopefully, I guess, because they're boring. But in any event, they come across the passage where it talks about Haman having delivered the information that saved the king from an assassination. Mordecai, thank you, not yet. That Mordecai having saved the king from an assassination plot. And so the king wants to honor Mordecai, and without telling him why, when Haman shows up at court, asks him what to do. And Haman comes up with, I don't know which of you said it, might have been Steve or Ken, but wants to basically play, king for a day kind of a thing, get dressed up in the royal robes that the king's already worn, and, paraded around the city on the king's horse and this whole thing. And instead of actually getting the honor he expects, the king says, do that for Mordecai. And so, of course, Haman is crushed. He does the thing, but then he goes home and he's in grief, and his friends, and he tells them, either he tells them for the first time that Haman is a Jew, or more likely, they begin to connect the pieces and realize that the whole situation is making it clear that Haman's plot, his plan is not going to succeed. And so they begin to counsel him not to do this, but before he has a chance to make a decision one way or the other, we see that the king's eunuchs arrive to take him to the banquet, the second day of the banquet that Queen Esther has planned. Now, I talked about this a little bit last week. It's kind of interesting because when you start to read the passage, when I read it as a grown-up, I read this, the first time when I heard this story, I was a little kid, and I read it many times as a child or as a young adult, but as I read it more as a grown-up, part of me wonders whether, when the eunuchs arrive to take Haman to the banquet, whether he's going to the banquet from the mindset of, I'm still in charge of this and I'm the best guy in the world, or the things that have happened to him, it's more like he knows that he's going to his execution, or at least he has a sense that there's this impending doom. We don't know, because we don't know what's going on in his mind. But that brings us up to chapter 7. And so if I could, I'd like to get somebody to read chapter 7, verses 1 through 6.
So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman."
Okay.
Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen.
Okay. So somebody mentioned this, I think last week. There's a lot of parallels between this story and the story of David and Nathan, when David commits the adultery with Bathsheba and then has her husband murdered through basically using an opposing army, basically. And then Nathan comes in and gives him this story that is designed to play on David's natural inclinations. So he tells the story of, the rich man and the poor man has only a lamb, and the rich man takes the lamb and kills it and serves it to his guests when he has guests that come from out of town, basically. And David's response is, that man deserves to die, he's got to pay him back, I forget, tenfold or whatever it is. And of course, he's playing on David for a number of reasons. First of all, because of David's background as a shepherd, and so the lamb is an identifiable factor for him as a shepherd, and because of that sense that he would have had of protection and natural instinct to protect. And then on top of that, he tells the story, and it's such a basically unfair situation that it's designed to trigger David's instincts about fairness and those kinds of things. And so it leads him right into the place where Nathan wants him to be. And Esther has done the same thing here.
And the other parallel, both with David and King Xerxes, they both were in a position of power to do something about it.
Yes.
They could make it just.
Yes.
They could make it right. They could make it fair.
And of course, in David's case, it wasn't a real event,
Right.
but it was because he was in a position of power. Yeah, his reaction was one of, "I'm going to fix this," kind of thing. I'm pronouncing judgment. And in Xerxes' case, as you say, he is the king. He's in a position to make it right. And so she has set him up by, number one, by going into his presence in the first place, by having him to the first night of the banquet, and then having him to the second night of the banquet, and so he's favorably disposed towards. We talked a little bit about the power of serving someone a meal, of serving and actually doing something for them, as opposed to just having it done. There's a difference between catering something and doing it yourself. And so, exactly what the banquet looked like, I don't know, but apparently it was prepared by Esther and her people, not by the king's normal banquet staff or whatever they were. Probably he had a banquet staff. Anyway, So there's this building sense of, you know, of a sympathy or empathy that exists there. And so then she doesn't just launch into, when he asks her what does she want, she doesn't simply start off by saying, well, here's what Haman's done. Now, why doesn't she do it that way?
She wants to draw attention to the problem before she says who created the problem. She
Okay.
wants the king to be aware of the problem without having Haman in his forethoughts.
Okay, so she knows that Haman, the king obviously values Haman highly. So if she starts off by saying, Haman did, you know, here's what Haman did, then the king begins with, here's my second in command,
Yeah.
and also here's the thing that I approved because I wasn't paying enough attention maybe. And so that begins the thought process from a standpoint of natural resistance, because now I'm inclined to be resistant to what I hear after that because you have played on my values. You've attacked the person who I value the most in terms of his role in the kingdom, and you perhaps implicitly at least attacked my judgment in whatever it is that I approve for him to do. So she doesn't want to start off by calling attention to who did it. She wants to start off by calling attention to what's done. And not only does she want to call attention to what's done, who does she first start with by focusing on what's being done? Herself. Okay? So again, she's personalizing it. So she's not starting off by saying, there's this group of people you hardly even know about out in your kingdom. No good reason why you should care about them, except turns out you accidentally made one of them your wife. She starts off by making it about her and then extending it from there. So it's personalized to the king, and as it extends outward, then that ties him into that personalization. So, you know, so once he identifies with her as the one who's threatened, once she starts extending that to her people, the king begins to feel a sense of a need to do what? Protect. Exactly. Ken?
And it's just the opposite of what would have happened if you started with Haman, because it would have been the attack on, I value Haman, you attacked me. She starts off by saying, if I have found favor in your sight, and she knows that she's found favor in her sight, so she's playing up to the fact that I am one of your favorite people, you do like me. And so she just starts in from that viewpoint.
Right. But she doesn't say it that way. She doesn't start always like, I'm one of your favorite people, so here's what I want. She said, if I have. So there's this implicit, you know, there's a humility to it that would be attractive to someone who clearly values his authority and values having at least some degree of humility in his wife. And so the critical thing for me though is that what she's doing is she's getting him to feel a need to protect her and by extension her people, and she's tying herself into that, and that's a completely human and natural instinct and response. Let me get Sarah and then let's do it the other way around. Go ahead.
Well, it appears as though Ahasuerus didn't realize that she was a Jew.
No.
And I think the second point is that the way that she revealed it, I think that Ahasuerus understood he was tricked.
By Haman, not by her. Yeah. And it's interesting too because she doesn't actually say, even to the point where she reveals that Haman has done this, doesn't actually say who she is or identify the specific group of people. She simply identifies Haman as the one who has become this threat and has you know, created this situation. Sarah, did you have? Okay, so you were just wanting to call attention. So that's so it's very important the way she does this, where it isn't a challenge to the king's authority. Rather, it is setting up a situation where there's a clear scapegoat, a clear person who's at fault for this, who can be viewed as having tricked the king, as you say. And so it makes it so that the king doesn't have to look at it from the standpoint of, wow, I really screwed up by approving this whole thing, you know? And I think that's very important, because you don't want the king to become defensive about his own judgment either. You want to make sure that he feels positive about that. And so Esther has set herself up as needing to be protected to her husband, and she's extended that need for protection to her family in essence. And so, and notice that she even says, if it were just that we were just sold into slavery, that I wouldn't even bother you with it, you know. Now, and you know, at this point, she hasn't revealed the thing about Haman. You know that the king is thinking to himself, oh man, I would have taken care of it then too. At this point, he's on board, you know. So she says that to him, and the king is probably ready to say, no, if it was just that, I would have taken care of that too. Because he's in that place where she wants him to be, that place where he's in the mode of the protector now. And so she says, I wouldn't even bother you with it, it was just being slaves. But, you know, he wants to annihilate my entire people. There's no way I can be silent about this.
Yeah, and another literary tactic that you see here, the way that it's written, she just doesn't say we're going to be killed. We're going to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated.
Right.
It's pretty fun.
It's weird. And probably there's not going to be any of us left either. You know, it's just, yeah, it's a very, what's the word? Kind of not over the top exactly, but it's a very strong way of saying it. So, so now the king is, he's not just curious when he asks the question, who would do this? He's asking the question in the same way that David has asked the question of Nathan, who did this? And it's who did this so I can go make it right. I'm going to go.
Who dared?
Who did? Yeah. So yeah. Well, yeah. So who dared to do this? And so, or presumed to do this in the New American. But it's obvious there's this sense of. There's a very similar sense of outrage to what David feels. David feels this because it's such an unjust thing, even though it's such a small thing in the larger scheme of his kingdom. Ahasuerus feels this because it's such a big thing, and it's unbelievable to him that somebody would choose to attack the family, the people of his chosen queen. The whole situation, he's been set up and basically pointed like an arrow at this situation now, and Esther's just letting them, you know, so literally, that's the whole thing, is it's just the bow's been drawn, the king is pointed there, and now she's just going to let it go, and off he goes. And so, of course, her answer is that a foe and an enemy is the wicked Haman. And Haman realizes whatever he thought was going on when he went to that banquet, this is worse. This is definitely worse. Ian?
It seems to me too that Esther's kind of playing on him as a man too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's get him good and angry, and then kind of drop the ball.
Absolutely. I think I think you're exactly right that he's doing that. She's playing on him as a husband and as a man in terms of working him up. And of course, we've seen with Ahasuerus that he is kind of not mercurial, but he does get angry pretty easily. And once he does, he's kind of hard to talk down. So this is all a very intentional thing, again, to point that anger at a specific target, so that there's no accident about where it's going to go.
Well, I think the king realizes the betrayal.
Yes.
And I think that's probably what motivates him.
Well, I think that is the ultimate driver of this response. So Ken, and then I'll go over to Steve.
One of the coolest non-biblical things I learned last week was about Chekhov's gun. I've never heard about that before. And here you mentioned the arrow. Well, Chekhov's gun just went off.
Right.
Because all the way back at the beginning, Mordecai told Esther, don't tell anybody you're a Jew.
Yes.
I don't think Haman knew. We know the king didn't know. The only ones that really knew were Esther and Mordecai.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. Not only we're pretty certain the king doesn't know, and I think we can be just about as certain that Haman doesn't know either, because it's reasonable to think that if Haman knew, he would not have gone to the banquet the first night, you know, much less the second night. I mean, there's no way that he would have gone willingly anyway, knowing that she was a Jew, because it would have been obvious that something bad was going to happen, or at least there'd be a fear that something bad was going to happen. Steve?
The most significant observation about this and the King David story is that the storyteller was able to get both of the kings to commit to the outrage before they knew who to be outraged at.
That's right. Yeah.
And once they had committed to that outrage, they couldn't back away from that.
Right. And in David's case, of course, it was a hugely deflating moment when Nathan says, it's you, and he has to deal with that situation. But yeah, as you say, he's already committed to it, and I think the kind of heart that David had, perhaps it wouldn't have required that, but Nathan wasn't taking any chances, and so David has no choice but to recognize his sin. In Ahasuerus' case, Esther deliberately does not make him the villain by saying, you know, you moron, you signed this thing and now my people are going to be destroyed. But he's committed to this, and so now, even if he would have wanted to spare Haman, he probably isn't in a position to do that because of the way he's become committed to the situation. Sarah?
Well, and the king had just done it to Haman not that long before with Mordecai, right?
Yeah.
Chapter 6. But I'm excited to actually be sitting in on the Esther class. It's my
There you
favorite
go.
book. And I think it's mostly because I feel it has paralleled my life a lot. Not saving my own people, but it's a book that doesn't mention God once, yet you can see him in there all the time. And a lot of times we find ourselves in those positions where you're not allowed to speak about God, or it's very unfavorable to speak about God, and you don't have to shove it down somebody's throat to get your point across. And I think we see that here with Esther. Also, the power of either a good argument or a woman. And I think, because sometimes we
Or
feel...
a woman with a good argument.
Yeah,
I mean, then you're
both.
really, you know.
But as a woman in the Church of Christ, or a woman in the sciences, or however you want to put that, sometimes you feel a little bit disadvantaged. You don't have the power to speak in front of the congregation, or sometimes you're devalued as a woman in the sciences because, you know, you have reproductive parts and might actually have a baby. And so, but the power of a good argument and how it can completely change the course of time and action that is supposed to happen is very powerful, and something that we need to keep in mind, that we do have power if used correctly.
Yeah.
Or we
That's true.
should use it correctly, maybe
Yeah.
that's a better way to put it.
And that's the thing is, I mean, you know, the darker side of this is that it is not that hard to manipulate people, you know, and you can manipulate people for good things or you can manipulate people for bad things, but it's a very dangerous thing to go into if you don't have very, very clear motives and a very, very good heart. You start manipulating people and it gets really dangerous really fast. Jerry?
It doesn't say it in any fashion, it's just my imagination, but I think Eve practiced that exactly with Adam.
All right. I just think Adam was a moron, but it's a real possibility he wasn't the brightest, best of our species. I don't know. So.
Well, he was the first.
He was the first, yes, but that doesn't mean he was the best. So anyway, okay. So Haman is terrified before the king and queen, and of course. It's interesting because since he doesn't know she's a Jew, you wonder if at some point in what she's saying, he starts to think, this might be about me. You know, again, a lot of it to me depends on what his mindset was when he left his home, when the eunuchs came and got him. If his mindset was, everything's great, and I've had a really bad turn here, but I'm going to have, dinner with the queen, everybody still loves me, it's all going to be fine, then probably not. But if he went and he started to realize this might be going bad on me, when Esther starts talking about this, he's got to be thinking to himself, wait, I've been around for all the recent decrees of the king and decisions about annihilating people, and the only one I can remember recently was the one I did, And so at some point in that conversation, he might be starting to go, wait, I have something I'd like to say, or I need to, run out to the restroom, or something like that, but it's too late because the whole thing has come to a head, and Haman is terrified. Okay, somebody read verse 7 through, let's see. 7 through the end of this chapter, so 7 through 10.
And the king rose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. For he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs, who were before the king said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided.
Okay. So first of all, I think it's interesting. The king gets up and he walks out. Where's he going? Why is he doing this? Why does he walk out into the garden like this?
Calm down.
I don't get the sense that he was successful, if that was what his goal was, but okay, maybe that's it. What else? Anybody else have any different ideas or similar ideas, or expand on that idea, or whatever you want to do?
How do we dispose of this guy? Kind of.
I mean, that's what I wonder, is because it says Haman realizes the king is determined to do him harm. I think the king is going out there basically thinking about, what's the worst thing I can do to this guy? I mean, I don't think he's going out there to try to calm down in the sense of backing off and thinking reasonable about it. He may be going out in the sense of, I need to calm down by doing something really horrible to this guy. But it's almost like he's afraid that if he stays in there, he's just going to kill him with his bare hands, and that's not good enough, you know? And so he goes out to think about it. Ian?
Well, we have a little footnote here in our Bible where and I've noticed this since the beginning, where in Esther, every time it mentions gallows, I've got a footnote that says, or stake.
Right.
Which is, infinitely worse.
One would think, yes.
That's a 50 cubic tall
Mine
stake.
says tree.
Tree, okay.
Yeah.
Sarah?
Well, Haman was the second in command, right? He spoke for the king. So what else has happened under the king's nose that the king doesn't know about? And maybe yes, he wants to do Haman harm, but before we do that, we need to make sure all the bases are covered. Damage control, because we can't go back in laws, right? So what else needs to be taken care of or questioned?
That's an interesting thought. I haven't really thought about that.
Staking somebody.
Yeah. Before we kill him, we probably better figure out what all he's done. More fundamentally, there again, there could be that kind of, there's a moment of introspection perhaps that's going on here as well, because he's trusted this guy, he's put him in charge of all this stuff, and now he's realizing that this guy has betrayed him and has abused that. And so the king may be out there in some part at least questioning himself and questioning the choices that he made, particularly to approve this particular venture of Haman's, you know. So it may be it may partly be an element of what David went through when it was revealed to him that he was the one who Nathan was talking about. Not maybe in quite at all to the same level, but to some extent the king may be thinking to himself, what have I allowed to happen? What have I done? And so there may be an element of that as well. Whatever his thought process was, though, it's clearly comes back to Haman, and he is the focus of the king's wrath at that point. Did I see somebody's hand? Okay. So he comes back in, he returns, and we see, so Haman doesn't follow the king because he knows that the king is already determined to do him harm, so he knows his only real chance is to get Queen Esther to give him mercy, or to ask for mercy, because obviously at this particular moment, and this has probably never happened to Haman before, at least not since he ascended to the position of power. This is perhaps the first time ever that the king is listening to someone else ahead of him, and in fact to his direct detriment. And so Haman isn't going to try to go talk to the king directly because he knows he's not listening to him, but he knows the king is listening to Esther, so he wants to see if he can get her on the right side. And of course, then we see as the king comes back in, Haman is falling on the queen's couch or whatever it is to beg her for mercy. And so the king interprets that in the worst possible way. Now, I think if the king had not been angry, if this was just a matter of him showing up and seeing this, he would almost certainly not have necessarily entered into that assumption right off the bat. But he's already in a mode where Haman is the bad guy, and so what he sees happen is seen through the lens of what he is thinking about Haman already. So the event that he sees justifies the response that he gives to it, which, by the way, is kind of an interesting little side lesson for us about how we approach our interactions with other people, and the degree to which we can be influenced by assumptions based on our built-in feelings about someone or experiences with someone to where we can sometimes make the wrong assumption or reach the wrong conclusion based on our previous dealings or just the way we feel about them in general or something like that. So we've got to be a little careful about that, because in this case the king is wrong in the sense of what he thinks that Haman is doing. Now, it doesn't ultimately make much difference for the story. It just redoubles the king's intention to deal with the guy as harshly as possible, because he sees him doing this. And so you can see on one level, like I said, if the king has already got this negative assumption about Haman, you can see his thinking. His thinking isn't that Haman is assaulting her in the sense of, in a vacuum, but more in the sense of, she is the cause of my trouble, I might as well kill her on the way out, kind of a thing, doing as much damage as possible on your way out, kind of a situation. But in any event, his response when he says, will he even assault the queen with me in the house, that is a statement of outrage, of I can't believe that he's doing this. And so what happens when the servants hear this? What do?
They hood him.
They cover his face, okay, or hood him or something like that.
I think it's interesting, you talk about the eunuchs and what they did. The palace staff kind of knows everything all the time. And I get the sense that Haman was not necessarily their favorite guy.
Probably not.
Okay, and they knew all about what he was going to do to Mordecai on the gallows, and they had it built, which goes back to what you were talking about last week. To build even if it was 50 feet versus 50 cubits, to build something that big, literally overnight, that took some doing. And who knows who was involved in making that happen. But the eunuchs all knew about it. And so they gave the king a perfect solution to assuage his
That's
rage.
right. So, and whether we're talking about a gallows or whether we're talking about a stake or whatever it is, this is kind of a big, prominent kind of event that's taking place here. And I think it's really interesting because, it says that as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now, I can tell you what all the cultural background to this is, but I think that all of us can read this without needing any actual background in the culture or history and go, yeah, this is bad for Haman. This is not, under the circumstances, you look at that and go, yeah, this can't be good. They cover your face. Essentially what they're telling you is that you're a dead man. For all intents and purposes, that's what's being said here. And so yeah, it's interesting, like you said, I absolutely think the servants wouldn't have liked Haman. Because who likes the guy who lords his power over everybody? Nobody likes that guy. You act like you like that guy because he's got power and he can make your life miserable, but nobody likes that guy. Nobody likes the guy who always wants to be referred to as doctor, in a scholastic setting, for example, just because they have a doctorate and the rest of you don't. Nobody likes the people who do that, Nobody likes the guy who's constantly talking about how he's got, more money or better education or whatever it is. Whenever you flaunt your power or your authority or your advantages over other people, most people don't like that. Nobody likes that. Even if you're a friend of somebody like that, you're not necessarily, I think the walls are coming down. Yep, there it goes. So clearly, the servants probably don't like the guy. On the other hand, it's probably likely that they do like Mordecai because he's humble, or he seems to be humble. He obviously was concerned about the king's welfare. He seems like kind of a decent guy, and most people tend to be attracted to stuff like that. And obviously, Esther's servants like her, and the king likes her, and she seems, again, to be a humble person and a person who is popular and likable. So Haman has built himself a house of enemies around him who he didn't have to worry about as long as he was in the king's favor and he had the power that he had. But as soon as that goes away, they're looking to take advantage of this. And so the king doesn't have to ask, what shall we do with Haman? One of the eunuchs is like, hey, I got an idea. I can tell you're looking for something. Here's my suggestion. Turns out Haman built this 50 cubit tall gallows or execution stake or whatever it is, and why don't you just kill him on that? And the king's like, yeah, that's a great idea. So that's what they do. And of course, the servant also, to add to it, he doesn't just say he built the thing, it's also, he built the thing for Mordecai. You know that dude who saved your life? Yeah, he built it to kill him. So even more so, the king is enraged.
Well, it's also poetic justice,
Yes.
because Haman had confided to his wife and his friends, and she had predicted that was gonna happen, and now he's experiencing it.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this absolute fulfillment of poetic justice, both because he was trying to do it to Mordecai, but also because he wouldn't listen, or apparently didn't listen to his family. So yeah, they hang him on it, or impale him on it, or whatever it is that they do. And then it says the king's anger subsided. I guess that's good, because what else is he going to do at that point? I mean, if he's still angry, I don't know what else, what more there is at that point. So, okay, let's do the very beginning of chapter 8. We've got about 5 minutes left here, and this we can do a real quick reading. Somebody read for me just the first couple of verses of chapter 8, please.
On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman.
Okay. Now this is not at all uncommon. First of all, if the king, in this, we see this particular practice continuing through into the Middle Ages even, where if a king were to, a noble were to commit treason, generally speaking, their household, their estate would become crown estate. It would now become part of the king's estate. In fact, there were a few kings who went out of their way to charge lots of people of treason so they could get more land, and not one of the finer periods in Britain's history, but whatever. So in this situation, this is pretty normal, and this derives from a basic premise of that we see in this era, like I said, going through the Middle Ages, which is that all property and the rights to property descend from the king's ownership rights of the property. So all land belongs to the king, and you just get to have it from him if if he gives it to you or sells it or whatever. And there's a certain degree to which that principle even exists in our country today, where owning property is under the overall guide or oversight of the government. And the government doesn't say that they own the property, but they do, for example, have the ability to go in and to use condemnation and other means to take control of property for situations where it's necessary, where it's needed. So these principles are very ancient principles. The king, once Haman has been found to be treasonous, takes possession of his estates, and he gives them to Esther, which is also not uncommon for a king to give to someone who's done him a service, or someone who has, been disadvantaged, to give them something out of the king's property. So he gives her the property. Mordecai, it says, comes before the king because Esther has now told him, the king, what Mordecai is to her, the relationship there. Because at this point, of course, her Jewish heritage is now public knowledge. Not only does the king know, the eunuchs, the staff knows, everybody is aware of this, so there's no reason to hide it anymore. And of course, you got to think from the king's perspective, this is all starting to seem a little bit convenient. That, it turns out that Mordecai, the guy who saved him, is also the cousin of Esther and the spiritual guide to Esther, who has done all this. On some level, at least, I suspect that the king, as well as Esther and Mordecai, is becoming aware that this isn't simply a matter of a whole lot of weird coincidences. That there's something more going on here, even though, again, the name of God isn't ever mentioned in here. On some level, at least, I suspect that the king is beginning to ascribe some of this to more than just coincidence.
I see a real parallel to Joseph and Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. When Joseph brought his family, actually first when Joseph revealed that his brothers were his brothers, I mean, the king was just all over that.
Yeah.
He thought that was a great idea. He sent gifts, he sent wagons for the little ones.
He sent an army.
Yeah, he sent an army to protect them. And when they came in, he said, Joseph, put them in the best part of Egypt, wherever you want to put them. And then he honored Jacob by having him come into his presence.
Yeah.
And so all of this stuff is now going on with Esther and Mordecai and the Jews.
Yeah.
In Xerxes' kingdom.
Yeah, and so, and part of this is probably, to a certain degree, the king is trying to make up for his previous mistake. And he certainly is, you know, it's kind of one of those things, it's about momentum and going in the right direction, and things are all going in the wrong direction, and once that gets turned around, there is this momentum now in favor of the Jews, in favor of Esther, in favor of Mordecai, and so Mordecai essentially takes over the role that Haman had. It says the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, gives it to Mordecai. He is symbolizing, by doing that he is giving him control the same way that he had given Haman control, the ability to basically make decisions and act on the king's behalf in a very powerful way. And then Esther gives Mordecai control over the house of Haman. So even though technically it belongs to her, and it would not have been appropriate for her to give it to Mordecai, having just received it from the king, it is entirely appropriate for her to put her closest male relative in charge of the house. And that would have been seen even by the Persians as an entirely appropriate thing. And that then gives him the resources to go along with the authority that he's been given. So Mordecai's elevation is complete. And not only is it an elevation, but the situation between him and Haman has been completely reversed. So Haman had the power, the wealth, the control, and he was intending to use that to have Mordecai executed. Instead, he is executed, and the consequence of that execution is that Mordecai is elevated to his position and his power and his wealth. And so the entire thing is kind of a turning on its head, which, again, not an accident. And not an accident that it's told in this order, because what we're going to see next, when we go next week, is the whole situation that Haman had manufactured is going to get turned on its head. So basically there's an inversion that we see happening on the smaller scale with Haman and Mordecai, and that is going to be paralleled on a much larger scale with the Jews and their enemies, as we see in the last couple of chapters here. But that is for next week, so we're going to take a break right now before the worship.